All right, I'm going to be tearing into a 2013 Suzuki King Quad 750 motor. You'll be able to use this video for the 500 as well as the 450 and the 700s. They're all going to be real similar. Some of the exact same lower end parts. The cylinder heads are going to be slightly different. Obviously, the cylinder and the piston are going to be different sizes, but you should get a general idea how this motor looks on the inside after we're done shooting this video. So I'm going to tear into the top end first. I'm going to move down to the cylinder here, the piston. I'm going to get into the charging system, and then I'm going to split the case here. And I'll break this video up a couple different ways so that you're not having to watch the entire video if all you're needing to do is get into your charging system, or if you need to just split your case there. I've shot several videos on replacing clutches on the other side, rebuilding clutches, replacing that belt, removing those, and showing you exactly how to do that. If you are needing to get into the charging system, I've done another video on how to replace the stator and the flywheel. The reason why we're tearing into this motor is because we've got just a very, very small knock in the bottom end. I'm assuming it's crank, but I'll show you that when we get down in there. But if you're needing a charging system video, make sure you check that out on our YouTube channel. I've done a couple different tests on the charging system here, these wires, the stator down here, obviously your flywheel, how to remove that. I'll also include in the details below the tools that we use when removing the flywheel in particular. It takes a special puller. I want to make sure you guys get the right one, so we'll put that link below. Make sure you use that link because there are hundreds of different flywheel pullers out there, different thread pitches, different sizes, different puller lengths, and I want you guys to make sure that you don't, when removing your flywheel, I don't want you to damage your crankshaft, because you may only need to remove your flywheel, you end up damaging your crank, now you're splitting your bottom end there. One other thing to note here, if you're just rebuilding your top end or your charging system, you do not need to pull your motor. Some people, it's easier to have it on the bench, have it right here in front of you so you can see exactly what you're doing. In the video that we've replaced the charging system, on the other King Quad videos that we've done, the motors are still in the four-wheeler. This one here, obviously motor is out, and the reason why the motor is out is because we're gonna have to get into this bottom end, I'm assuming. So stick with us, we'll show you exactly what to do to get into that bottom end. If you guys have questions or comments, make sure you leave those below. If this video's been helpful, please give us a thumbs up. We want to continue making videos that you guys can use and help you guys figure out how to work on your own ATVs. Thanks for watching. All right, to remove our top cover off of our cylinder head here, it takes a 6mm Allen. I don't like to just use an impact right off the bat. I like to loosen these up and then use an impact if you want to speed things up. I do like the DeWalt 20-volt impact driver there. It works really, really slick. I feel like it's not too much power to where you're breaking bolts off, but it's enough power to remove most of the bolts that you need. I also have the 1/2-inch drive, which works better for larger bolts and nuts there, and just a little more power. But for these Allen bolts, again, those are 6mm Allens, and they are a specialty bolt, so make sure you keep those together with the head cover. You also have little seals here that can be removed. You can just take and pry those up, or if they're sticking in here and they're sealing just fine, you can just leave those. That's not an issue leaving them. Now we've got around here a rubber gasket, and that'll seal this cylinder head cover really, really well. So sometimes it'll take a small rubber mallet or a dead blow to push this off, or sometimes you can just take your fingers there and push up on it, and you should be able to lift that up. You don't want to damage or break this top nipple here, as it's a vent for your motor, and you don't want to break that off or you'll be replacing that. To replace it, it's just two 8mm bolts on either side here. If you take and push it up like that, that is your cylinder head cover. Underneath of here, you've got your camshafts. So you've got an intake here and exhaust here. Now, if you're going to adjust your valves on this model, you'll find top dead center, and I can do a totally separate video on that if you would like. I don't want to take you guys' time showing you how to adjust the valves if you don't need to right now, but an inspection cap here, pull this cover off, you'll spin your motor over that way, you'll find top dead center, and then you'll check valve clearances. You'll then remove your camshafts here. Obviously, before you do that, remove your tensioner here. and then replace those shims. I can show you those when we get a little bit farther in here. And then if you need to go up or down a couple different sizes, you can put those in there, put our caps back on, put our cams back on, put our cam holders back on, install your caps here and here, obviously your cylinder head cover, and that is how you adjust your valves. I guess I skipped a small step. Double check that those valves have the right clearances after you put the new caps in there. Sometimes what I like to do is spin that crank around a couple times to get those shims in there and seated properly. Sometimes if they've got just the tiniest little piece of grit underneath of them, they won't completely seat until you spin that piston over a couple times and then check those tolerances again. So again, intake, exhaust. And before we pull those camshafts and the camshaft holders here, I like to remove our cam chain tensioner. That's going to take a 5mm Allen. Go ahead and remove that. The other thing that you can do is remove this 10mm, and it's right there. You can remove that, but you are going to have to remove these Allen bolts anyway. So remove that. That's going to pull your spring out, and there's a little rod down in there. Make sure you keep that together. Also make sure that O-ring is on there. That way it seals those pieces up there. But like I said, again, you do have to remove this anyways, because your cam chain tensioner is not actually going to unlatch itself until you completely remove this. And you can see there how it is. It's an automatic tensioner, so it'll go in. It's just spring loaded in with that spring that we removed. But coming back this way, you've actually got to take and push that lever in. So we can push it all the way in right now. That way when we go back together, we put that spring, that pin, and that screw on here. It's going to actually push on that guide and tighten up your cam chain. This has got a gasket right here. Make sure that gets replaced when you're going back together. Now that you've got your cam chain tensioner out, you should have some tension on your cam chain. Now you'll be safe to remove your camshaft holders. 8mm bolts there. What I do just to speed things up, I'll grab a 8mm, put a conversion between a 3/8 and a 1/4 inch, and I'll just impact these bolts off. I do this in a crisscross pattern so that you don't ever put too much tension on one side or the other of these cam holders. All right, once you have those bolts loosened completely, you could actually take them out and remove them if you'd like. I like to keep them here and just be careful removing them. That way we know exactly which bolts go where. I do believe they're all the same size. It looks like it, but this way it just kind of keeps them in place. You want to make sure that these dowel pins stay in place there. We'll set those cam holders aside. There's two places that you can get your fingers underneath of here to pry up. What you don't want to do is take a screwdriver and pry up on these, or you might end up damaging different areas there. So we've got our cam shafts exposed now at this time. The nice thing about this is a lot of times the cam chain will go over top of these cam shafts. That's not the case with these. So you're actually just going to be able to remove these without actually removing your cam chain. Exhaust cam here, and you'll be able to tell that it's the exhaust cam because it's got the automatic decompression here. You want to make sure that that springs properly, make sure it goes back to where it needs to go before you put that back together. But that is your automatic decompression lever there. And same thing with our intake. It doesn't have the automatic decompression, but we'll take and set that aside. Now we're going to remove our plug here. That's going to drop our cam chain sprocket down into place. Then we can go ahead and remove our cylinder head bolts there. All right, we have a 10mm Allen bolt here on the side of our cylinder head. We're going to use a wrench to loosen this up to start. Like I said, then we can grab an impact if that's what we want to do. But I don't want to round this off by using an impact to start. These are sometimes extremely tight. I can get you the torque specs going back together here for this. But just based on the size, a lot of times they are extremely tight, so I don't like to use our impact driver. Small cap here, and it does have a seal. So you want to make sure that that comes out with the bolt here, or at least you keep track of where it goes. Okay, now we've got it down far enough to where we should be able to lift our chain off, and I just pull up on one side or the other and just kind of roll that off of there, and then you can take your gear and slide it up. Now, if you are not going down very far into your bottom end, you want to make sure you hang on to that chain. A lot of times what I do is take a zip tie, tie it to it, that way we can grab it just in case it does drop down. because you don't want that to drop all the way down into your bottom end, and then you have to tear into it farther because you let that go. So keep that in mind. You want to hang on to this cam chain if you're not going down into the bottom end. There's our cam shaft sprocket there. And because we are going down into the bottom end, I'm just going to let this drop. Now, that being said, before we go any farther, you need to know that you do not want to turn your motor over without hanging on to this, because what happens is if you get down in here and you start turning your motor over, this cam chain can get bound up and it can damage your crankcase and your bottom end. So don't turn your motor over if you're just going to let this go. All right, next we've got a handful of 12 millimeter bolts for our cylinder head, and then we also have some 10 millimeters. So I'll show you where those are at. I'll start with the 12 millimeter here. Okay, we've got 4 inside of the cylinder head here. We've got 1 on the outside. Okay, that is all the 12 millimeter. Now we've got 10 millimeter. All right, these are a little bit more tricky because they are so tight to the sides here. You can't get a 10 millimeter impact socket on there. So a couple different things you can do. I like to grab our 1/4 inch extension here with our 1/4 inch 10 millimeter socket here, and then I can still use my impact. The other thing that you can do is just grab a thin walled 3/8 drive impact socket, and you can probably slide it down in there and get it off as well. Have the 4 10 millimeter bolts off of there, or at least we have them loosened up completely. And by the time we get all of those loosened up, our cylinder head is actually separating right here at our cylinder head gasket. We've got a water sensor here, so keep an eye on that so we don't break that. We've got our intake boot. Our throttle body sits here. I've showed you that in several other videos. So you want to make sure you keep an eye on those. You don't rip or tear that boot there. And then you also have this hose that's going down to our water pump clear down here. This is our thermostat. There's no reason to pull this at this time, but I'll just show you what it looks like underneath of there. We've got 6 millimeter Allen bolts here. And we might have a little bit of coolant drip out when we remove this. All right, we've removed the 2 Allen bolts there. There's our thermostat cover there. Here is our thermostat. And I don't think there was any issues with this. I've showed you how to test these. Make sure you check that video out if you feel like you've got a cooling problem. Going back together, you just want to make sure that that seal goes in there properly. And then I'm just going to take and snug these bolts up just to get them into place there. Okay, I'm going to take this bolt, and just to keep everything together, I'm going to run this one back in. You do want to make sure that you have got there's a spacer here or a washer that is model specific, fits that shaft very, very snugly. You also have a brass seal there, or a brass crush washer that'll actually seal that up like it should be. I'm gonna run that back in just to keep track of that. Then I need to remove this hose that's going down to our water pump, and then we'll be able to pull our head off. All right, now we are ready to remove the head. We still have our 4 10 millimeters, so we just don't want to take this head and tip it over. Those will just scatter all over the place, but we can just very carefully remove that. There'll be dowel pins in the bottom of this head there, and that's kind of what's holding us up at this point. Okay, so we've got that cylinder head completely removed. We've got our head gasket here, and then I don't want to tip this over, but I'll lay it on its side so you guys can kind of see what's going on here. There's actually 2 spark plugs in the 2013 and up King Quads. They did that because, like I've gone over in my other videos, those cylinder heads actually get a lot of buildup on them, holding those valves open, and then you lose compression. You have a hard time getting your King Quad to start. So Suzuki did a good thing by adding a spark plug here. It just helps that cylinder to burn more cleanly. The spark plugs are fairly expensive, but you do want to make sure and get those replaced every time you service your four-wheeler. So it's going to set this cylinder head aside. All right, so this gasket we're obviously not going to reuse, so that'll get thrown away. We've got our cylinder here. We've got a cam chain tensioner here. We can pull that out at this time. Might have to wiggle it a little bit out of there because our chain kind of fell down on top of it. Inspect that, make sure that that guide's in good condition. This guide here is actually where the tensioner comes in and pushes against. So you want to inspect that spot. We can't actually remove that guide till we get down into our charging system a little bit farther, but when we get that pulled off, you want to inspect that guide. This is typically the one that's going to wear the most. So we've got a coolant line here that we need to remove, and then we've got two 10 millimeters down here. We can use our 1/4 inch extension with our 10 millimeter socket on the end there. Remove those two. Those are actually the only bolts, the only nuts that we need to remove our cylinder. We've got our radiator hose here that we'll remove. We'll get that hose pulled off of there. I pulled it off the bottom as well just to get it out of the way. We're going to set that aside, and now this cylinder is ready to come off of there. You can see here we've got a little bit of buildup on our piston here. It's not near as bad as what the old ones used to be. To remove the cylinder then, you can just pull it off of there. You can slide the piston up out of the bottom there. So that is what the cylinder looks like there. We do actually have some scoring in our cylinder, so I don't think that's going to be our issue completely. I'm going to check that crank to make sure it feels good. That'd be great if this is as far as we needed to go. And based off of the scoring there, possibly it could be as far as we need to go, but we're going to check this crank here in a second when I get this area cleaned up.